This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Diving into the challenges and changes facing law enforcement and our criminal justice system on this edition of inStudio. It's all too easy to form an opinion about law enforcement and our criminal justice system. But what is the reality? What are the day-to-day challenges of protecting our cities and communities? Oftentimes, the media and dramatic television shows may give the impression that crime and violence are on the rise. But are they really? On this edition of inStudio, we'll find out. Plus, we'll discuss with local law enforcement leaders and criminal justice experts what it's like to fight crime in a rapidly changing, technologically advanced world. Our guests bring both practical and academic experience and expertise to the subject. Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan has been in law enforcement for over 4 decades. He began his career in the United States Air Force. His law enforcement career has encompassed work in patrol, corrections, investigations, armory, and public relations. Sheriff Morgan was first elected as Escambia County Sheriff in 2008. He has since gone on to be re-elected twice more in 2012 and 2016. Pensacola Police Chief Tommy Leiter began his law enforcement career in 1990 with the Pensacola Police Department. He subsequently climbed the ranks to sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and assistant chief of police. Over the years, his assignments have included uniform patrol, investigations, SWAT, and K-9. Chief Leiter is also a graduate of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Dr. Kimberly McCorkle is a professor of legal studies, chair of the Department of Legal Studies, Public Administration, and Sports Management, and an administrative fellow in the Office of the Provost at the University of West Florida. She is a former state prosecutor who focused a good bit of her efforts on fighting domestic violence. She is also the co-author of American Homicide. Dr. Richard Huff has been teaching criminal justice and associated courses for over a quarter of a century. In addition, he has held various positions in law enforcement, including serving as Director of Law Enforcement and Corrections at sheriff's offices. These days, he is an author and faculty member in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of West Florida. He has co-authored 3 textbooks, including American Homicide with Dr. McCorkle. Currently, he is wrapping up a text focused on the use of force in criminal justice. Santa Rosa County Sheriff Bob Johnson very much wanted to be a part of our program this evening, but unfortunately, due to some scheduling issues, he was unable to join us. Sheriff Johnson is attending the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Development Program. We wish him the very best, and hopefully he can join us on a future date. Thank you all. Welcome.
Thank you.
Sheriff Morgan, let me begin with you. What are the biggest changes that you have seen in your career?
Oh gosh, see, you're going to age me here. You know, you have to be careful when you talk, especially to the very young officers that are now coming into law enforcement, the young men and women who, you know, take that huge step in deciding to, you know, be of service to their community. And there's, you know, probably no bigger job, I would say, than deciding to go into, you know, the area of law enforcement or public safety probably as a whole. Gosh, when I started, you know, we still did the police desk blotters on manual typewriters. And then we went to IBM Selectrics and IBM Selectrics that were correctable, and we thought that was such high tech. So I've actually been in and around law enforcement since the beginning of, you know, computers being introduced into law enforcement. I know, Tommy, we didn't ride horses and have single action revolvers. We didn't have those quite. But watching that develop, you know, I would say probably about technology and what is important to me in law enforcement is it became so apparent very early on, I think, to those of us that watched this evolution, that you had to stay on the leading edge of this thing. Everything from, you know, something a little simpler, if you will, in changing the way we do business within the criminal justice system. Dr. McCorkle will tell you when we went from in domestic violence to evidence-based prosecution. You know, was a huge step forward in that, you know, you have reluctant witnesses, and that's more in the psychology, not so much the technology, other than taking photos and that sort of thing. But we have to move this process along. Right now, we're lagging so far behind in law enforcement, and this is our legal system, not law enforcement and our desire to do it, in the areas of computer crimes across the board. Our legal system is not, and I'm not sure it's capable of keeping pace with the changes in technology. And so many crimes that are committed, we know they're crimes, but they're not even classified as crimes. They're so far on the leading edge of technology and computers. Identity theft, so widespread today. That's as a result, that's the double-edged sword of technology. Facebook, we saw that in a recent case with the Boyette murder. We're inundated with tips from our citizens on their Facebooks and their blogs, et cetera. And quite literally, when we were working with the Georgia authorities up in a little town called West Point, Georgia, we were getting confirmation it was Mr. Boyette and his accomplice was there. We were responding on the west side of town to a quote-unquote eyewitness, this is no kidding, he's here out in the woods area, and we're getting the SWAT team together to go out there. So you're kind of doing one of these numbers, and you have to respond to everything. So.
Dr. McCorkle, why don't you expand on that? You're a former state prosecutor. Expand on the role that the legal system is going to be playing.
Well, I couldn't agree more with the sheriff that the role of technology and its impact on the criminal justice system, the legal system in general, is, I think it's probably on all of our minds as one of the leading kind of issues in the legal system and in law enforcement today. So from the investigative perspective, as they can speak to, it has changed a lot about the way we investigate crime, but from a prosecutor's perspective, it's changed how do we prosecute cases. Because we know that jurors are impacted, prospective jurors are impacted by the role of media, by what they see on television, by what they see on their social media. And so we know that when they come into the criminal justice system to serve as jurors, they have a certain expectation about the way that we will present cases to them, the way that they will be convinced that a crime has occurred. And they have an expectation that there will be a lot of scientific evidence, that there will be a lot of evidence that will, like they've seen on television shows, that will convince them beyond all doubt that a crime has occurred. And sometimes what they have seen on television is completely fictional. And those kinds of tools don't exist. But also, as the sheriff mentioned, in terms of the way we define crimes, we just have to kind of catch up with what's actually happening in kind of the cyber world, the way people commit crimes now, the way people are victimized by crimes. How do we define that accurately? And then how could we investigate it well? How can investigators, law enforcement officers have the tools that they need, the expertise that they need to investigate those crimes? And then how do we prove it in court? And so I think it presents challenges for the legal system that will take some time until we can really kind of catch up with our resources, with training of people who are going to serve in these roles moving forward. So it's a really interesting time, I think, in our system now.
We've actually had jurors after a trial, Jeff, make a comment that, well, we would have voted for a conviction, but there wasn't any DNA evidence. And you say, well, there are crimes committed where there may not be any DNA evidence. Well, I just can't vote for a conviction.
Right.
I mean, I know you can get DNA evidence.
Yeah.
Dr. Huff, that's kind of in your wheelhouse. Take off on that.
It is. DNA, which we all think of now as the rock star of the forensic world, has only been used in criminal cases since 1986. It's pretty recent, and really when you think about it, as the sheriff said, the majority of cases, and Dr. McCorkle can say this too, as a former prosecutor, they don't use the forensics in that way. If you have all of us witness a crime, you don't need any DNA to go with that. You don't need a 3D image, to holographically appear here on the table. And so with what we call the CSI effect, it is this very low-level training that the public believes that they get, and oftentimes prosecutors, defense attorneys, juries, even judges, not really understanding what are the limits of the technology, what's there, what's not there, and what do you really need. And circumstantially, most cases are still solved in that way. The point about the cyber crime and kind of where we're going there, I think we saw over the weekend like the largest hack ever, an unprecedented one, touching 150 countries and I don't know, a couple 100,000 different people. Where law enforcement, where we all go in terms of trying to investigate that, figure out who did it, and then deal with all the victims is mind-boggling. So, as the sheriff said, when you go back and look technologically, where all of us, really were at the beginning points of our careers to where we are now and what officers are facing, and remembering that out of 18,000 separate law enforcement agencies in the U.S., and we're unique in the world in that way, the vast majority of agencies, 85%, have fewer than 50, 60 people. So the resources aren't there. The personnel, the depth of training is not there. So it takes everyone working together.
Chief Leiter, you just took over. Congratulations.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Just newly confirmed as Pensacola's Chief of Police. What's at the top of your mind as you take this new role on?
You know, we talked about, again, the collaboration, with the local law enforcement. For me, though, it's what I found with the young rookie police officers is everything that they do is social media. They embrace social media, and that's, you know, a great asset. But there's the flip side of that is they don't have that face-to-face contact. It's the inability to talk to somebody one-on-one on whether it's a traffic stop. At the end of the day, every single call for service we go on requires an interaction between a police officer and a member of the public. Most people aren't going to have an interaction with law enforcement unless they're a victim of a crime or if it's a traffic stop. So we have to capitalize on absolutely every single contact that we have. There's this perception on a national scale it's kind of anti-law enforcement. And to have an officer who, again, that's what they're struggling with is that face-to-face contact, and then get it into their mind that they have to, the ability to capitalize on every single contact, because the likelihood is that person they're talking to, they may never have another contact with law enforcement. So you're really building their perception on what the Pensacola Police Department is.
Dr. Huff and Dr. McCorkle, you're both teaching, and so you understand what Chief Leiter is talking about as far as the young people being so dependent upon social media and so focused on that kind of stuff. How do you marry the two together? How do you marry taking advantage of that knowledge they have about social media and technology and at the same time teach them great communication skills and listening skills, et cetera?
Let me give you a dual perspective first. In 30-some years of teaching police academy, you know, they're not allowed to have electronic devices during class. This would seem to us, certainly sitting at this table, well, that's just logical, because we really don't multitask. People use that term. That's not really a thing neurologically. You don't multitask. You do things in sequence. Sometimes you're pretty quick at certain things, but you don't multitask. What I've taken to doing after so many years as a law enforcement officer, but also teaching at college until doing it full-time, I've now had students literally have a contract with me that they will not use electronic devices in class, because not only are you not paying attention to the conversation around you, but you're distracting the next person over who's looking to see what it is you're surfing and doing. So you're right, you have to leverage the technology. You want to expose them to what's good about technology and how we use it in the broader kind of world and society, but it's a challenge, because the distraction, you know, whether we go to an analogy of driving your car and texting, et cetera, or flying a plane and texting, it's there. It's a big one.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say if you talk to any college professor now, they would reflect on just what you said, which is that we know generationally millennials and those who are behind them are really expert at technology skills, and some of them are digital natives. They've been using it since they were born. But what we have to work on constantly is helping them build social skills and helping them build their communication skills. So I know we all struggle with ways to do that, but in a lot of classes, one of the things we'll have them do is work in groups and work in teams and do group projects and make presentations where they actually have to talk to people. And a lot of times they hate it, but it's really about building what goes with their excellent kind of technology skills, and that is to make them good communicators. And that can be a challenge, yeah.
I want to get the two of you to kind of comment as you bring new officers into the fold on how you address that and what the long-term plans are. When we come back here in just a couple of moments, we'll continue our great discussion about law enforcement in the modern tech-savvy world after this brief break. You're watching inStudio on WSRE television, PBS for the Gulf Coast.
Unlock your newest member benefit. Over 1,000 episodes of your favorite PBS shows. American Masters, Antiques Roadshow, Nature, Nova, Masterpiece. Watch the best of PBS anytime, anywhere. Become a member, sign in, and start streaming today.
Welcome back to In Studio on WSRE Television, PBS for the Gulf Coast. We're discussing law enforcement in the modern tech-savvy world with our guests, Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan, Professors Dr. Richard Huff and Dr. Kimberly McCorkle, and also Pensacola Police Chief Tommy Leiter. Chief Leiter, we were talking as we went to break, talking about young people and the social media and the role that that's playing and how they need to learn to communicate. As you look to hire new officers, and I'm going to pose this to both you and Sheriff Morgan, what are you looking for? What sort of talents are you looking for with these young folks?
Again, there's a place for social media, so most of them come to the table with the tech savvy, that ability. It's the oral interview when we talk to them. It's the ability to communicate. And a big one for us is common sense, is basic as that sounds. You think of every single decision that you make today as you go out through your day, and not many of them have the implications that the decisions that a police officer has to make. Every single call that they go on, from a simple traffic stop to a domestic violence to a robbery in progress, all of those have serious implications, and the decision-making skills that they have to make is trying to identify the candidates who are willing to change, not just embrace the technology, but are willing to take on that responsibility. It's a decision-making process.
Sheriff Morgan, you want to add to that?
One of the impacts several years ago, not long after I took office, Jeff, there was we spent an entire sheriff's training time. We have 20 continuing educational hours that we have to take every year as a sheriff. And this particular course was on character versus competence, and this ties into the technology side. What we're finding with young people is their moral and ethical compass is not there, because they are trained by social media, they're trained by television, movies, etc. And so the things that I grew up with, and probably most people at this table, what we learned in our churches, in our schools, and in our homes, so many of our kids are devoid of today. And so we put them through a process today of actually, testing that, if you will, scenario-based. This incident occurred, what would you do? Do you report this? Do you do whatever? And it's amazing the responses you get back from kids, because remember, technology doesn't teach ethics. It doesn't teach character, etc. If you're of average intelligence and you have a desire to learn, we can take pretty much anybody and teach them law enforcement. If you don't bring that basic social skill set to the table, we can't teach character and ethics. That time lag is so far gone. So, there's this huge gaping hole, if you will, in our process of recruiting, training, etc. To where, as odd as it sounds, Admiral Fetterman found that in the Navy. He started his core values program in the Navy based upon what he discovered. For those that don't know Admiral Fetterman, huge people person, loved his sailors, etc. And I actually had a chance to meet the Admiral and his wife, and he was doing a presentation, and he relayed that story that he was holding a captain's mast, was going to discipline this young sailor for stealing from his bunkmate out of the foot locker. And so before he administered the action, he asked this young sailor, said, son, tell me, why did you do this? I mean, what were you thinking? And the kid's answer was, well, it wasn't locked. And Admiral Fetterman said, it wasn't locked. He says, well, yeah, if he'd have wanted it, he'd have secured it. And so Admiral Fetterman said it came crashing down upon him that there was no ethical or moral compass there, that it's okay to take whatever's not secured. And unless you're physically guarding it, then it doesn't matter. It's just kind of free for everybody to take. And that was, believe it or not, the impetus for the core values that the Navy teaches. And he said, because we're getting young sailors, and of course across the Department of Defense, young people that aren't bringing a skill set to the table that we need. We certainly need that in law enforcement, because I tell folks that. I spend a lot of time thinking about this, as I'm sure Chief Leiter does. In the minimum, I can take your freedom from you because I'm empowered by law to do that. Place you under arrest. Take your freedom from you. In the extreme, we can take your life under the appropriate set of circumstances. That's a huge and awesome responsibility. Yeah. And so for us to, as so many different areas are doing today, we talk about, well, in our criteria that we establish for recruitment and retention of young men and women, where do we set that bar? Our bar's got to be high. With just thinking about the authority that we carry, you can't minimize that criteria in any way. And we're having a difficult time recruiting today.
Jeff, let me piggyback on what Sheriff Morgan said. Just had a great experience working with the Navy as their policing expert in a program called Sailor 2025. they're looking at what will the 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old in 2025, we have to think of them as an 8th grader right now. What's the training going to be like? Now, being out at the Law Enforcement Academy a couple times a month, in training, what the sheriff said, that becomes part of our mantra for a lot of the instructors talking to the new recruits is, look, we can take ethics, for instance. We can come here today, we're not going to make you ethical, we're going to talk to you about the ramifications and decision-making skills, back to that issue of decision-making and what may happen. But fundamentally, if they haven't gotten that in the home, in their faith community, from their peers growing up, you may want to address, I know you were telling me about a recent article and story, how surfing the web and Googling 100 different things, a lot of people are looking at that as a replacement for expertise and knowledge. Oh, well, I've Googled something. Clearly, I know as much as you do, Sheriff, or you do, Chief, because I Googled. And, it's like, wow, if we don't make that clear to, young people at the right age and try to give that appreciation that there's more to these subjects and topics and that awesome responsibility.
And I would just point out briefly that in all kind of pre-professional paths that we have at the university, we teach ethics classes and that kind of thing. And I think to suggest or to agree with what you all have said, it's really important that we address kind of what is ethics and what does it look like in the profession that you think you want to join, right? And not to assume that they have that basic kind of understanding. And to give scenario-based training and that kind of thing so that they can really understand in this situation, this would be the ethical choice and this is what you shouldn't do. And I think research supports that that's really the best way to kind of indoctrinate, train people for their professions.
And Jeff, our whole society, certainly our legal system, is based upon our ability to understand and tell the truth. The adversarial system, et cetera, our search for. And I think, the issues that we're having in our communities and across the nation today are based upon that very thing. We have so minimized the truth, if you will. We have a whole, generations now of people, and we call them spin doctors. What is a spin doctor? It's a paid professional liar. I want to put the appropriate spin on my version of events. Now, the problem with that statement, my version of events, is what does it have to do with the truth? And so we have so obfuscated that process that you see that almost, to quote Jimmy Carter, back in the 80s, there's this malaise because people have become so jaded today, they believe nothing. And so now we have all of these, you've created chaos, unfortunately. And that's why in law enforcement, where there was a time, well, again, let me date myself. As a young man, David, if you're ever lost or in trouble, find a policeman, find a deputy. They're there to help you. I can't tell you what's so demoralizing. It's only happened to me a couple times, thank goodness. But you'll be out shopping, and you know this, Chief. You'll have a family that has a child that's acting up, and they'll say, if you don't behave, I'll have that man take you to jail. I mean, look at the whole, that's 180 degrees off from when I grew up as a child, where law enforcement was viewed as this honorable profession, the teller and bringer of truth, basically. That that was our job, was to make sure that justice at the beginning was served, entered into the court system, et cetera. But we were the beginning of that, and today that's been, more than minimized. I think it's almost non-existent.
Talk about that core values growing up, and we lose better than half, probably 75% of our applicants just through a polygraph and background. It's just atrocious.
Absolutely.
It's to think of somebody says, I decided I want to be a police officer, and it's not what you got caught doing. There's a polygraph and a background. Think of everything you did, and you're going to have to come in and confess all your sins, and it's just kind of scary at times, I think, to think about what they're doing.
Right. How do we fix the problem? How do we change it? Is that the $1 million question?
Well, I think, to put, some positive light on this, I do think you're seeing a turn in the country today towards those things. And I will tell you that you've got to stay in the fight, Jeff, meaning that, as I tell my folks all the time, this change begins with me. It begins with you. For us to throw in the towel, trust me, if you leave the field of battle, the enemy wins. You've surrendered the field to the enemy. And so what we do is at the Sheriff's Office, and I know Chief Leiter, because we're fortunate to have his former boss, Chief Simmons, working with us now, is that we've determined we're going to set the bar high and keep the bar high. My approach to most problems is I'll do more with less. Give me 100 officers who have a moral compass and understand ethics and the job that we do, as opposed to 200 who don't. Because I can work with that core group, and I will tell you, you tend to gather like-minded people around you, and our folks at the Sheriff's Office, and I'm sure at the PPD know, the standards here. If you don't, we're not joining you. Okay, you're joining us. And let's make that perfectly clear. We have high standards at the Sheriff's Office. And to be one of us, you're going to maintain those standards. If not, you'll soon be gone. And that's the standard you have to set.
We're running about 25 vacancies out of a 150-man department. And we actually had that discussion in-house about, let's look at our standards. Is there something that we're requiring of our candidates that is too difficult, obviously, to have them meet? We decided to hold the line, and we'll just work 20, 25 officers down. We're slowly filling that gap, but it's just taken us so much more time than it normally would. They did tell me, in fact, it was Chip Simmons said one of the most important decisions you'll make as a chief is who you're going to hire, because that'll make or break an agency.
You live with that decision.
Yeah.
That if you
For
lower that
25,
bar,
30 years,
There's so many. First of all, I thought Chip Simmons was retired on a beach in Jamaica. I'm not positive. That's what I heard.
no, we got a positive ID on him.
Okay, all right. I'd check those prints. I'm just saying. One of the things we talk about in the classroom, at the academy, this idea about recruitment and where do you find the next generation? We did something today, as a matter of fact. We went out on one of the national policing websites in preparation for the show, and we said, what do you folks on the street see as some of the current issues right now? We got a lot of good feedback. One of those was the very same issue about how do we recruit, where do we go find them, who are they going to be, what do we tell them? So part of this is a transition into just what these two gentlemen said, the leadership part, the philosophy part. I teach the community policing component at the police academy, and we lead off with a little talk about, hey, tell us about what shows you watched growing up, policing shows, and they'll lead them all off, and I'm like, okay, so now we all remember those are actors and none of that's real, right? And you get a good laugh, and I said, well, remember, the chief or the sheriff may not be available the day you get there to take you aside for 30 minutes and give you their personal philosophy of this is how police work gets done. Again, it's they're joining your agency, not the other way around, which can be challenging when you look at millennials, Generation X, et cetera, and the turnover. You see somebody 23 years old who's held 7 or 8 jobs. That's concerning when you want to invest a year and the money it takes to get somebody certified and through training and through the field training officer program and out on the street, and then have them go, this really isn't, all that interesting. So one of the great, terrific partnerships we've had with both Pensacola Police Department and since Sheriff Morgan's been in office with the Sheriff's Office and the university, I know with Dr. McCorkle, my program, we're constantly having people do ride-alongs with them. We're sharing their training opportunities. They come and talk to our students constantly. They're always at our job fairs. That kind of cross-pollination is really important, gives the agencies and the community, what they need and want. But it is always that brass ring of you'd rather work short than work with somebody, who's not up to snuff. There's plenty of examples in American law enforcement, kind of recent history, last 3 or 4 decades, of we've had 200 positions approved all of a sudden by county commissioner, quick, let's go hire a bunch of people, and abandon some of the standards, and you pay for that in short order, medium order, and long-term order by losing your community, by having the wrong people. And so it's always wise, as the chief and the sheriff know, take your time, get the right person, or work short. Deal with it.
Interesting. We're going to continue this great conversation on keeping our community safe in the modern world when we come right back. You're watching inStudio on WSRE Television, PBS for the Gulf Coast.
WSRE is celebrating 50 years, and the PBS show that put local kids inspired to make a difference in the national spotlight. In the 2000s, Zoom motivated 6 to 11-year-olds to investigate, create, and problem solve. It was television by, for, and about children, and empowered them to be more. Once engaged, they volunteered, teamed up, and gave back. Zoom connected kids with each other, and their communities for 7 seasons. Their projects and fundraisers collected countless dollars and changed lives. Their stories, produced by WSRE as Zoom into Action segments, went national. Children from across Northwest Florida didn't just watch the program, they were on it from coast to coast. That's pioneering children's television, and just one reason we're celebrating 50 years.
Welcome back to inStudio on WSRE Television, PBS for the Gulf Coast. We're discussing law enforcement in the modern tech-savvy world. Our guests, Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan, Professors Dr. Richard Huff and Dr. Kimberly McCorkle, and Pensacola Police Chief Tommy Leiter. Sheriff Morgan, I saw something, I believe, on your website or in one of your publications, you talking about generational crime. Explain that.
It was several years ago, Jeff, probably my first term, or certainly no later than my second term, where I heard some officers speaking, and they had made an arrest of this young man. And another officer piped up and said, yes, and I arrested his grandfather X number of years ago. And so did a little checking, and sure enough, and it wasn't an isolated case, it's numerous cases. This gets back to the sociological side of law enforcement, which we get drawn more and more into that process. My approach to my community, even though I outreach to a lot of areas, that has nothing, to be quite honest with you, with law enforcement. But we've filled that gap in so many of these areas because there was a void there. And if we're not willing to step into that and sometimes lead the charge and start the impetus to fix that, and in this instance, how do you get into the home? How do you get into stopping this generational process? But as I tell folks, if a child grows up in a home where using narcotics is the norm, they grew up, mom and dad smoke dope, they use alcohol to an extreme, et cetera, that's a child's norm. And so now you come in and say, well, that's all wrong. And the child says, well, mom and dad always did it, so you're telling me smoking marijuana is wrong? Well, my whole family smokes marijuana. Now, that's the normalization of what used to be referred to as aberrant behavior.
Mm-hmm. There's a flip side to it, is we have a lot of generational police officers. Mm-hmm. Yes. We got a lot of, Chief Goss's grandson works with us, and Sergeant Gaudet's daughter works with us, and it's on and on and on. And we have, children working at the Sheriff's Department and vice versa.
So Dr. McCorkle's happy story?
Well, I think it lends itself to this discussion about just how important family is. Yeah. What are you going to teach your children? Because if the dad's oftentimes, unfortunate, a drug dealer or a criminal, that's where the children are going to go. And my father was in the Navy, and a lot of the ideals that he taught growing up, you kind of embrace that, and I've found myself in law enforcement. So I think it's a positive side to that story, is just how influential
but we have no effect over there, Jeff, and that's the frustrating part.
Yeah. We can't, from law enforcement
we can't be in every home. We can't remove a child from that environment because, until it pops up on the radar, of course, for the law enforcement community. But how do you affect that? Because it's going on all around us, and there's no way, number one, for us to know, and number two, we don't have the resources nor the expertise, to be quite honest with you, to do that intervention that's required.
You must have seen a lot of interesting scenarios as your time as a prosecutor.
I did, and I think I agree with the sheriff. I know that, and the research bears this out, that when we examine kind of what causes crime, why do people commit crime, we know that in the research a lot of the correlates include living in a household where crime was committed, where you have family members who've committed crime. Other correlates include poverty, lack of education, and that's not to say that those things cause crime. They're just related to higher rates of the commission of crime. And from a law enforcement perspective or a prosecutor perspective, these aren't problems that just the criminal justice system needs to address, right? They go way beyond that. They include the education system, our political systems, healthcare systems, a lot of kind of, there's a need for all of those kind of groups to come together to help prevent crime to begin with before law enforcement arrives or a prosecutor has to handle the case and prosecute it, right? But it feels sometimes from the perspective of the practitioners who are in it that it's intractable, that these are crimes or problems that can't be solved, and they take really, they're challenging, and they take generations, and sometimes it can look very difficult, but we do know from the research that there are some kind of promising efforts to kind of intervene and to address some of that.
Let's give you one of the happy story parts. First, because that's a great intro. 25 or so years ago, I built the first juvenile boot camp in the state of Florida. You had to have committed 8 or 10 or so felonies just to get in there as a juvenile. When our first group graduated, 17 young men, there was only a total of 7 family members who came to see those 17 people. We had 20 big burly deputies with tears in their eyes as they're getting ready to see these folks off. Later, I worked with the Department of Juvenile Justice, and one of the things I always had to tell the officers is, look, 95% of these young people who are in a detention center, they're going to be fine. They're going to be us sitting here. They're going to be okay. They're going to get through that decade of their 20s when their prefrontal cortex finishes cooking, and when they go through relationships and they get real jobs and they wake up and they mature. And that's really important for officers always to know. Not just folks who work in corrections, but law enforcement officers, because people don't call us over for the happy puppy story, and they don't say, we just had a birth, come over and have coffee and cake with us. Law enforcement doesn't get that very often. So we have to, I refer to it as inoculation. You have to, remind the officers that, and young prosecutors too, things overall are actually good. Stephen Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, wrote a great book. I'm still trying to make my way through 700 pages, The Better Angels of Our Nature, why we're living in the least violent times in history. These are the least violent times in history. U.S. homicide rate is half of what it was 20 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't hear a lot about that. And officers don't hear much of anything about that. And so that perspective, call it sunshine if you want, but it's if you get cynical if you aren't optimistic. You don't stay in this job if you're not optimistic.
Well, and I mentioned that sort of at the top of the show, is if you watch the news or read the news or watch movies or whatever the case may be, most people would probably think we're living in the most violent of times. And you say that's not the case.
No, it's not. And you have to look historically, perspective-wise, with all through history, the wars that were going on all the time. Yes, with the deluge of the 24/7 news cycle that we were talking about a little bit earlier, we get lots and lots of immediate images and information about things that are happening. Not to say that when things happen, not tremendously tragic, really important, have to resolve these. But we're in the least violent times in all of human history, and it continues to march downward, and we make progress. That's an important perspective for anybody in public safety, without question. But that's part of that, especially when you're dealing with people who are just seeing very difficult and challenging situations. Think of people working in an emergency room. If they never, went to the neonatal ward or to pediatrics and witnessed a birth or helped somebody, get over a debilitating illness, they would think that was, the entirety of kind of what we see. And so having that perspective and giving that to officers, I think that's, really tremendously, important as that reminder to keep you mentally healthy. Whether that's a segue to body-worn cameras or not, I don't know, but just the idea about perspective and what do you see and what do you not see.
And the media does play a large part in that. I call it the new car effect. If you go out tomorrow and buy a new Ford Mustang, just to throw a make out there, what are you going to see for the next 6 months everywhere you look?
Ford Mustang.
The new Ford Mustangs. And you say, oh, there's a Mustang. And beforehand, you wouldn't have paid any attention to that. So when I keep in the forefront of the public, mayhem, then it's all around me. And you can actually create that fearful environment. And then add social media to that, to where, social media, especially Facebook and Facebook friends, et cetera, is, the gossip bench of days of old. It's just now, to the 10th power. And so people Facebook each other, and now again the truth is no longer a part of the discussion. It's what I heard and what I passed on. And every time it's passed on successfully, it loses a little more of the element of truth, to where there's nothing. I use an example, local media at the beginning of my second term. There was an elderly gentleman murdered on the west side of town, 73 years old. He was living with a crack-addicted prostitute, and in exchange for sex, he would give her money, of course, and that supported her habit. Well, one night she comes home and determines that she needs money, and he refuses to give it to her. Well, she hit him in the head with a wine bottle and killed him. At that time, the media was taking a turn where they wanted to do man-in-the-street interviews. We wanted to know how our community felt about crime. There was a studious attempt to not interview elected and or appointed officials. We want the community feedback on this incident. Well, you're getting now, and you're soliciting pure opinion. Nothing is based upon fact. And so it was reported that he was on his knees, his hands were bound behind his back, his head was bagged, and he was shot in the back of the head. And so I'm getting inundated with phone calls. People want to know, Sheriff, we got somebody executing people on the west side of town. Why aren't you telling us about this? And where do you get this? Is my question. We haven't had any execution-style homicide on the west side of town, but that was picked up and reported because that's what the community had heard. The story had been passed around several times, and so now it went from this, tragic homicide, of course,
Sure.
to now it's an execution. And that's social media. That's how stories change.
The sheriff mentioned the sociological perspective a little bit earlier, and we call that mean world view. And mean world view is, think about with kids, our young, ones being formed. If all they get are negative, bad images, they develop the suspicions and an aggressive or defensive attitude because of mean world view.
I'm sorry, go ahead,
So
please.
when we went around to talk about the book recently in the last couple of, year and a half or so, everyone would always say the homicide rate is the highest it's ever been, and we couldn't convince them that statistically that's not true.
Yeah.
That we are in the last year seeing a surge in some big cities, which we're still trying to examine, but it's a limited number of large cities that they think is connected a lot to gang violence and gang homicides, but they're trying to kind of figure out what it is, but that overall our homicide rate is the lowest it's been in decades.
And you only need one Chicago to skew all the data.
That's right.
As I've told folks, Jeff, Santa Rosa, I'm sorry, Sheriff Johnson's not here, is an excellent example. They'll go several years without a homicide. But if next year, after having a couple of years without homicides, they have one, how much is their homicide rate increased?
Right.
100%.
Exactly.
It's 100%.
Exactly.
And that's all everyone will talk, oh my God, our homicide's up 100%.
Pulse
right.
nightclub shooting.
Yes.
Yeah.
We
Exactly.
talked about that at the International Homicide Investigators Association last year,
Yep.
and otherwise Orlando had a homicide, 35, I think, homicides.
Yep.
Now, my gosh, what a tragic, horrible incident. The year of the 9/11, the towers, when the towers went down, that 3,000 plus citizens, that got put into one version of the homicide stats for that year. And then with a little footnote that says, by the way, these, were all killed in the attacks,
Right.
so that people don't misconstrue and misunderstand.
Chief Leiter, how do you as a leader, how do you reach out to the community and let the community know that things are better than perhaps the perception?
That's a great, where social media comes in is a big player today. If you're going to reach the public today, you better be on Facebook, you better be on Twitter, and embracing social media. Me and my command staff, we go door to door. We're going to continue to go door to door. We'll be in most, if not all, of the neighborhoods in the city, and I always say that talk less, listen more. And it's that face-to-face contact. I'll be on our doorsteps, in your kitchen or in your living room, and what is it that you expect from us? At the Pensacola Police Department, we talk to them about how to file complaints, anonymous complaints if they want to, and it's that capitalizing on every single contact that you have and hitting that core values with our officers of courtesy, integrity, and professionalism from day one to the day that they retire. And again, I represent every police officer with the city, but so does my rookie. The newest police officer that wears this uniform represents me and every other police officer that wears it. So I think it's hitting that message home and capitalizing on every contact that we have.
Law enforcement in the modern tech-savvy world. Some interesting conversation here. Our conversation will continue after this brief break. Easy for me to say, huh?
WSRE is celebrating 50 years and remembering the show that gave the station its largest audience. Not Julia Child, not just a French chef. For 17 years, Earl Peru mesmerized viewers with classic recipes celebrated on both sides of the Atlantic. The New Orleans native crisscrossed Europe and Japan to study under some of the world's best, then shared his passion with generations of aspiring chefs. That's because gourmet cooking was their classroom, and it was yours. Gourmet cooking tempted viewers with irresistible recipes, many rich in local history. Earl Peru's Gourmet Cooking, the first WSRE production to air nationally from the station celebrating 50 years.
You're watching In Studio on WSRE Television, PBS for the Gulf Coast. Our topic, law enforcement in today's modern and tech-savvy world. Our guest, Pensacola Police Chief Tommy Leiter, Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan, and authors and professors, Dr. Richard Huff and Kimberly McCorkle. Dr. Kimberly McCorkle, I should say. Right here on this desk is a weekend version of the Wall Street Journal, and we mentioned Chicago a minute ago, and the headline is, "In Chicago, Police Go High Tech." I'll get you to elaborate on some of the high-tech things that you guys are doing. But first of all, there's been a lot of talk in recent times about body cams. So explain the role they play and what that's all about.
Actually, a former Chief Chip Simmons, now Chief Deputy Chip Simmons, started the program, and we embraced it in the city of Pensacola, the police department. And our internal affairs complaints are down. It looks like use of force came down, the types of force came down. And the idea, of course, is if you have a body camera in every single one of your contacts, it keeps the good guys honest. They know that they're being recorded. And it keeps the police officers honest also. I think they're less likely to be argumentative. They're more likely to do that de-escalation. There's a flip side to it. I talked about all of the difficult decisions that every single police officer makes day to day, every single call. Now I'm going to strap a body camera on you, and we're going to videotape every single one of those contacts, and you're subject to being scrutinized on every decision that you make. So there's an added level of stress there. So I think a big part of it from the leadership perspective is to let them know that we recognize just how it's a difficult and a dangerous job on the best of days. This job it's very rewarding, but again, every call has the potential to go south. And just relax. You know, we're not going to scrutinize everything that you do. These are our policy and procedures. You know your core values. You know what your mission is. And as long as you operate within those parameters, I understand there's 4, 5, 6 different ways to handle any call for service. And as long as you operate with, a good heart, you'll be just fine. So.
We're beginning that. Our agency, of course, is considerably larger than the Pensacola Police Department, and we're like the 14th largest sheriff's office in the state of Florida out of 67 counties. There's a tremendous amount of legal issues with public records laws in Florida, when to tape, not to tape, permission, not permission to tape when I enter your home. Let's say you've been a victim of a burglary and now we're in the house and we're videotaping your entire house now. And so it becomes a matter of public record. And then, of course, we run into the legal side with the defense attorneys, et cetera, on when you turn the tape off, turn the tape on. And so you're in now an area that pretty much with evidence is verboten, meaning you cannot tamper with evidence. Once I start a taping process, any editing of that, now the evidence is tainted. So there was a whole host of those things we had to work through with the state attorney's office. So we're now beginning to start the body cameras. I think as a whole, the only thing the body camera program is going to show, Jeff, to be quite honest with you, is civilians acting badly. In the high percentile for officers, 90% plus, are good officers, and good officers make mistakes. It is an issue now with recruiting. Because as the chief said, the stress and anxiety of the job is high. We tell our officers every day, just assume you're being taped wherever you go, and that's pretty much true. Everybody whips out I can't tell you the number of public appearances I make where, if I just look in the audience, there's people with their cell phones videotaping, and they don't have my best interests at heart, I can tell you. Right. But again, it's just part of what I do. I try to let all of our officers know that you must assume that also. And now we get into the area of I edit that and I put it on social media. And it has no bearing, again, on the truth. Everything's taken out of context. They'll insert things into that. And so now officers are saying, even if I'm innocent and that tape is out there and it's been, again, tampered with and now it's on social media, is it really worth the anguish that I'm going to go through with my family and the potential litigation that comes on, et cetera? And so that's a huge thing with us, I know, with recruitment. So when you add all of these things up, and I'm looking at assets and deficits and choosing your career in law enforcement, that's certainly not on the asset side. Mm-hmm. So while I embrace body cameras, because I can tell you I have a high level of confidence in my agency, and again, if I've got bad officers, I need to know who they are so they can be gone. But it's the boon to law enforcement. It's not there for body cameras, I can tell you. We're wanting body cameras to fix a problem that body cameras won't fix.
You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it was well said. We're in early days. We haven't done a lot of research yet to know what the full impact is going to be. There are benefits and there are certainly some concerns. Whether it's going to help us prove more cases from the prosecutor's perspective, it's hard to know yet because of all the things the sheriff said. Sometimes the camera doesn't show everything that happened, doesn't give the complete context. And so I think it's a challenging time and it's going to be interesting. Certainly across the country we're seeing this kind of national push where we think that body cams are going to be this panacea and they're going to solve kind of all of our issues, and I don't think that's going to be the case.
Well, and something interesting here that you know, of course, a lot of this push come you know, from the Department of Justice. But I know that that when you're working a joint operations with federal agencies, federal law enforcement agencies, they won't allow you to tape. Now, why is it good for me as a local law enforcement official, but it's not good for the federal government? You know, if you're going to hang a body camera on law enforcement officers, let's hang it on everybody. You know, what is it that you know, that we're doing locally that you're doing federally that people should know about?
Yeah, let me add to that. All of these really great points. I know to Dr. McCorkle's point, you know, do we get some evidence? Absolutely, there's going to be some in some cases, maybe that. One of the problems, and I consult for probably 25 Florida law enforcement agencies on police practices and use of force specifically. You know, you're getting one perspective. You're seeing a camera here, and I may be looking over here as an officer. And you have this difficulty 2, 3, 5, 7 years later when an agency who's done perhaps everything completely right, an officer, and there's a civil suit. And people think that this recording device is all that the officer saw, is all that everybody else saw. You know, so many research experiments done on this over the years. All 5 of us will see something different. If something drops out in the studio, we're going to perceive different things, see different things. I spend so much time trying to explain that to federal juries about why the officer is saying exactly in their perception what occurred at the moment something happened, and maybe a witness is saying something else, and that for them is accurate. It may not be the truth or the fact, but that their perception. And so, you know, as Dr. McCorkle said, yeah, the camera, we have this perception or this thought by the public again on another issue that they're not fully thought everything out yet, thinking that that's going to cure a problem, explain an issue, and it may in a few cases, but the jury is definitely still out as far as this goes.
It's interesting you say that because I think they have discovered that the same thing with the airplane crashes. People always say we heard or saw a certain thing that just really did not happen or was not, it just couldn't have happened, so to speak, when you get into the science of it all. But interesting enough, in this article, and I'll give credit here to the Wall Street Journal for this weekend, or for the weekend of May 13th and 14th, but there's a piece in here that says on one screen they watched a live feed from a surveillance camera of a drug dealing happening in a nearby street corner. And then in quotations, "We're building a case," one officer said. Now that's totally different, huh? What are your thoughts on that?
From the standpoint of, because we're getting all that feed.
Is it good, or is it violating my privacy?
Before the show, we were talking about this. Dr. McCorkle and I presented in England last year, and so we had an opportunity to talk to a lot of British officers and British professors and prosecutors about, for instance, in London, what they refer to as the Ring of Steel. You have cameras, CCTV, absolutely everywhere. When we were doing research for the book, we were at several major homicide units around the U.S. and seeing what video feeds they have and how a lot of cities and communities and towns, you know, are taking advantage of the availability of video. And yet, you're still going to have to go through a trial. You're still going to have to go through, you know, court procedures. It cannot, you know, hurt but to help, other than the fact that criminals, as we know, you know, the vast majority of all crime is committed indoors, out of the sight of anybody. And so it begs the question about, as the sheriff pointed out, you know, how much good is it going to do us? Maybe from one standpoint of making sure officers are, to a certain extent, doing what we hope for them to do, also keeping down citizen complaints. That research, a lot of that's already being done, and that's been very helpful to agencies, you know, because you can't just, or you have people come in and go, here's what happened. Deputy Morgan did this, and you play the tape back. No, he didn't. So helpful from that standpoint, but
It will be interesting to watch as things evolve, and I'm unfortunately out of time here. And so just in a couple of minutes, and just get a couple of final words. You have written a new book, quick like?
The use of force in criminal justice. It's a textbook that's really important. A lot of what, as we all sitting here at the table know, a lot of the books that we find in our business are someone's opinion, some thought, some perspective. Here's how you should do something, without the scientific, the empirical backup to what actually happens. That's the difference between a textbook and something you pick up at one of the local bookstores. So that's really important. It's used for a specialty class that we do. Like I said, Pensacola PD, Escambia Sheriff's Office, both been great partners, still ongoing in looking at use of force issues in criminal justice, and hopefully this is going to benefit the field.
What are you most optimistic about in about 30 seconds?
So my primary interest in law enforcement issues has to do with intimate partner homicide and how we look at the research that's available, the stuff that's out there that's innovative. And one of the most useful tools right now that's helping law enforcement and prosecutors is called lethality assessment, so that we can examine when law enforcement arrives at a homicide or a domestic violence scene and they perform a lethality assessment. It helps them to determine kind of a triage, which cases are the most serious, which ones are maybe very minor, and then to kind of react accordingly. And I think there's some good promise there, and I look forward to that, because in some of the cities where we've seen a little bit of an uptick in homicide rates, some of those have been intimate partner homicides.
Interesting.
Yeah. You pointed out that's one of the only homicides you might be able to prevent.
Yeah, interesting. Sheriff Morgan, what optimistic here in about 30 seconds?
We have a tremendous community in Escambia County that we've managed to form a very effective relationship with. A lot of the issues throughout the country we don't have here, and one of the reasons why is at the Escambia County Sheriff's Office and the Pensacola Police Department, as Chief Leiter pointed out and his predecessors, we have a tremendous community outreach. If we're invited to speak at a church, at a civic gathering, it doesn't matter. I tell folks I'll address National Potato Week. It doesn't bother me. If I get an opportunity to interact with our community, starting with young people in schools, et cetera, a robust school resource officer program, and on and on and on. It's that, you always talk about communication as a key. It truly is in our line of work. You have to have connection with your community.
Chief Leiter?
We talked about how difficult it is to recruit qualified candidates, but boy, when you get one, you get the gem and you put them in a uniform and put them to work. That is probably the best part of my job. They say I mentioned before, the hardest decision you'll make is who you're going to hire, but the best decision you'll make is who you're going to hire as well. And the future is bright in law enforcement. Despite this, we talked about the naysayers. We've got a phenomenal future at the police department.
We may have small numbers, but they're going to be quality people.
They're going to be great people.
That's awesome. Thank you all so very much. Greatly appreciate your time. We have been discussing law enforcement in a modern and tech-savvy world. Our guests have been Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan, Pensacola Police Chief Tommy Leiter, and professors and authors Dr. Richard Huff and Dr. Kimberly McCorkle. Santa Rosa County Sheriff Bob Johnson very much wanted to join us this evening, but due to scheduling was unable to do so. Sheriff Johnson is attending the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Development Program. We wish him all the very best, and hopefully he can join us on a future date. By the way, you can watch some of our past in-studio programs on YouTube or at WSRE.org. Also, you can see a full-length interview I did with Dr. Huff and Dr. McCorkle about their book, American Homicide, on my show, Conversations. Just go to WSRE.org/conversations or search Conversations with Jeff Weeks on YouTube. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.